Thank you, Michelle. So our speaker today is Alex MacDonald. Alex is an executive staff specialist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory within the Civil and Commercial Space Division. He is recognized as an expert on the economic history of American space exploration and contemporary private sector space activities. He is formerly the founding NASA program executive of the Emerging Space Office, a former research faculty member at Carnegie Mellon, and was the first research economist, my apologies, at NASA Ames. Alex was a Clarendon Scholar at the University of Oxford, where he obtained his doctorate, and a member of the inaugural class of TED Senior Fellows. So today his talk is entitled The Long Space Age, An Economic History of American Space Exploration. Please help me welcome Alex.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. What I want to do is tell a story of American space exploration that stretches back about 200 years. I think we're all very familiar with the story of formation of NASA and Sputnik and the Apollo program. But that gives us a particular framework for thinking about space exploration that I think we've been finding is less helpful than I hope you will find the one that emerges from a much longer time frame. And what I'm going to do is focus on the economic aspects of this history in an effort to elucidate the various financial dynamics that really drive space exploration. These are the motivating questions that we're going to be following through. Who has funded space exploration over long periods of time? We certainly are seeing a lot of private sector activity that's been emerging recently in American space activities. Formation of SpaceX, Virgin Galactic. One of the driving questions I had was how often do we see investments of those types, of those economic magnitudes? And are there patterns in the types of motivations that drive both people and institutions to fund space exploration? And ultimately, what can this long history of American space exploration tell us that is helpful for navigating a future in space exploration today? And the two pictures on your left there really is a reminder to me of the events that drove this particular research project for me about 10 years ago. One was the flight of Spaceship One, which, when I was doing my master's degree in economics, was kind of fascinating to me because, as an economist looking at this, it looked like a bunch of guys had just built a spacecraft in their garage. And I kind of, wondered, well, how did that happen? And of course, it was not exactly in the garage. It was, Burt Rutan's company, Scaled Composites, funded by Paul Allen, who was the co-founder of Microsoft at a rather significant level. But this process of individuals, private sector individuals building spacecraft seemed to me like a new phenomenon. And so I wanted to understand what some of the origins of that were. And then the other event that happened around the same time was President George W. Bush announcing that NASA's new plan was to build a base on the moon. As an economist, this seemed like a very interesting challenge because, of course, if you're building any sort of habitation and having some sort of logistical supply there, well, that is just as much an economic development problem as it is an engineering one. But for me, the economics of all of this really starts with astronomy. And this is a picture of Caltech's Mount Palomar Observatory. And the complexity of this really borders on the complexity of modern space exploration projects. It was essentially committed to begin in 1928, and it was finally opened with a ceremony and first light in 1948. It had all the usual challenges of a large space exploration project. General Electric initially was tasked with making the 200-inch mirror with fused quartz. They failed. They had to get a new contractor for the mirror, which was Corning Glass. They made it out of Pyrex. So a lot of these challenges that we're used to, for example, from the history of Hubble and occasionally from the history of the James Webb Space Telescope, is really something that has a long history. And so when you're looking at the economics of all this, I think it's really critical to include the economics of our early astronomical observatories because they were the instruments of space exploration. And fundamentally, the experience that we have looking at objects in the solar system and beyond through telescopes is very similar to the experience we have looking through the eyes of our rovers. Right? We're sitting here on Earth. We have an expensive piece of technology mediating our engagement with those objects, and they're expensive and complex. And so this is really a reading from the critical essay that George Ellery Hale put into Harper's to raise the funds for his project. He was very conscious about how he could manipulate public opinion. And this was one of the kind of core descriptions of how he understood the economics of all this, and I'll just read it. Like buried treasures, the outposts of the universe have beckoned to the adventurous from immemorial times. Princes and potentates, political or industrial, equally with men of science, have felt the lure of the uncharted seas of space, and through their provision of instrumental means, the sphere of exploration has rapidly widened. So you can see that for Hale, the people who are partnering with him are effectively these princes and potentates, right? These industrial partners. And of course, he gets the Rockefeller Foundation to fund this observatory. Previously, he'd gotten the Carnegie Foundation to fund his earlier observatory. Okay, so what are some of the economics of all this in an empirical sense? This was the data set I put together of all the observatories built in the US between 1800 and 1940 or so. There's 42, and you can kind of see that the overall expenditures are fairly significant. There's two ways that you can adjust values in the past for up to the present day. And the two that I use here are to adjust relative to the cost of the principal input, which in this case was skilled labor. And that's the production worker compensation index inflation adjusted metric. Or you can adjust according to the size of the economy at the time. So if you're interested in questions of how much would this have represented of the total American economic activity, use a GDP ratio metric. If you're interested in questions of, well, how much does this represent in terms of economic complexity, I'd argue that you should use a production worker compensation index. Anyways, really exciting economic inflation adjustment stuff, I know. Regardless, the numbers here are significant. You have about $8 billion of GDP ratio adjusted expenditures on US observatories. Not a small number, but of course, if you think about NASA's total budget, which is about somewhere between $17 and $18 billion a year, it's also not all that large compared to what we have today from publicly supported funds. But the key here is the two numbers below. The percentage of this that came from the private sector was 96.6%. Almost all of the funding for this type of space exploration prior to the Second World War came from the private sector. This is a list of all these observatories. Obviously, I'm not going to go through them all, but I want to highlight a few of them just because they've got some really fascinating histories. The Cincinnati Observatory is a really great story. A guy named Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, classic 19th century name, shows up in Cincinnati with a bunch of lantern slides, right? Kind of the early PowerPoint of the mid-19th century, and he gives this really amazing set of talks. And at the end of this lecture series, he goads the citizens of Cincinnati, which was then the sixth largest city in the US at the time, one of the first frontier cities that had been founded after independence. He goads them into funding the third largest telescope in the world at the time. And he argues that what America needs to do was to show the Tsar of Russia, seriously, in the 1840s, show the Tsar of Russia that the free citizens of America can, through voluntary contribution, fund a telescope that is larger than his. They didn't quite succeed, but they got pretty close. And who did succeed was, of course, the Boston Brahmins, who were not going to let the people of Cincinnati show them up. They raised enough money to get the largest refractor in the world at the time at the Harvard College Observatory. And there actually ends up being this kind of observatory movement, which was really actually sponsored by John Quincy Adams, not sponsored, but kicked off by John Quincy Adams. In one of his inaugural addresses as president, he declared that the US needed a federal observatory. Congress did not support him on that initiative, but that was what the president wanted. And you've got this fascinating movement where you have the Detroit Observatory, also funded by individuals from the city coming together, Dudley Observatory in Albany, the Georgetown Observatory, which is another great one, which was a Jesuit observatory. And actually, the Jesuit leadership in the Vatican was really not encouraging of this observatory, but the guys in the US just kept pretending not to get the letters, and so they, anyways, benefit of having long logistical chains for communications back then. Here's a number. Of course, the biggest one in the data set is the Lick Observatory. And James Lick was the richest man in California, and he really wanted a legacy for himself. And so initially, he considered building a very large pyramid in downtown San Francisco. His friends convinced him that wasn't a great idea. Then he thought about building large statues of his parents and surrounding the San Francisco Bay with them. And people convinced them that that might not be so great because there might be targets if the Russians ever invade, because the Russians were kind of considered close back in those days. Eventually he decides to build the world's largest observatory, and it was the very first mountaintop observatory. And he's actually buried underneath it. And he was the richest man in California, gives 17.5% of his entire estate to this single project. And so that's why it ends up being this kind of $1 billion in GDP equivalent terms observatory. And if you want to think about what the richest man in California today, if he gave 17.5% of his estate to a single project of space exploration, well, that would be Larry Ellison, who's got about $41 billion. So you're looking at about an $8 billion project. So it is within historical precedent for individuals in this country to fund very, very significant projects of space exploration. And this goes down as well. McCormick was another one of the people who really tried to found his own observatory in his lifetime. He was a brother of the McCormick Reaper Company, right, one of the first mechanical harvesters. And then, of course, the three big ones down at the bottom, the Yerkes Observatory, Mount Wilson Observatory, Mount Palomar Observatory, those are all George Ellery Hale's observatories. And his actual first observatory was funded by his father, because his father was an elevator magnate in Chicago after the Great Fire, which is a great time to be in the elevator business, because you got to rebuild all the buildings. Anyways, he is really one of the most incredible astronomical entrepreneurs, because not only does he found those three observatories, which successfully are the world's largest observatories, each in sequence, he also is one of the founding figures of Caltech. He founds the National Research Council, and he does all the fundraising for the National Academies building in Washington. So if you ever really want to feel inadequate about your achievements, I would really encourage you to read through George Ellery Hale's biography, because it's really quite incredible. Okay, so what does this look like on a kind of decadal time scale? I mean, one of the first things you notice, of course, is this is a rather volatile kind of path, right? You get these kind of large spikes when individuals come along and fund a very large project, like you do in the 1870s or the 1840s. 1870s, that large spike is largely because of Lick, but in the 1840s, it's largely because John Quincy Adams had kind of created this elite interest amongst large portions of the kind of elite population in the East Coast to build these observatories. So it's kind of more of a social movement aspect to it. This is kind of the production worker compensation one. So this shows you the kind of increasing complexity of these projects over time, but also this kind of die-off. You get a peak, dies off, peak, dies off. I haven't really extended the data set, but I think if you, once we can, you'll see a similar phenomenon going on, right? 1960s, big peak, die off, right? So there's a very volatile expenditure profile for space exploration. Okay, so that's observatories out of the way. But when do people really start thinking about developing spaceflight? And to be clear, I'm not really going to deal with robotic space exploration. I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk on the development of human spaceflight capabilities. And what's interesting is that the development of spaceflight really begins with thought experiments, right? Science fiction, right? People sitting around and thinking about how this might come to pass. And there were actually three individuals in the 1830s who independently developed concepts for human spaceflight. Edgar Allan Poe, right, the famous poet and author. John Leonard Riddell, who was a scientist who independently invented binocular microscopy, was also the New Orleans postmaster, and he gives the very first public lecture on spaceflight in New Orleans in the 1840s. And Edward Everett Hale, who was a pastor and a publisher, and he ends up as the chaplain of the US Senate. And all these guys gave very serious consideration to how you could get into space, and all of them thought that it would happen through private initiative and private funding. And of course, most famously, you've got Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, which is really one of the foundational texts of human spaceflight development, because it's read by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Hermann Oberth, who, when they're teenagers, are inspired by it to then dedicate their lives to the development of spaceflight. And the part that I want to highlight here really is that it also includes the first cost estimate for spaceflight, which, as an economist, I find really just charming. And Verne kind of estimated it would take about $4 million in the 1860s to do this. And actually, I think that's a fairly respectable estimate. $8 billion GDP ratio adjusted. It's definitely an order of magnitude or more off, but it's not 3 orders of magnitude. He understood that this was a complex project to build this large cannon, the Columbiad, that would be able to shoot people into space. And he expected that it would all be, again, like the observatories, from privately funded voluntary contributions. You also, in the late 19th century, start getting a lot of these emergent themes that dominate kind of space advocacy movements in the latter part of the 20th century. Utopian themes introduced by the pastor Edward Hale. And you also get this incredible book, which is Man Abroad, which is written by, well, we don't know who. An anonymous author, and I will say here, if anyone can find out and show me evidence to trace that book to its author, I will give you $100, because it is one of the most incredible texts, because it describes the United States of America expanding to encompass the entire solar system in the 1870s. And that's just incredible. I mean, that was how much they were thinking about it. There was a particular economist named Henry George, who was in New York, and they described an asteroid colony dedicated to the particular type of socialism that Henry George was espousing being found in people living on this asteroid called Henry, Georgia. I suspect the author was somewhere in New York, because around that time Henry George was running for office in New York. So there's your lead if you want to go track down who this was, but it's an incredible text. And then kind of finally on this note, which is where this picture is from, John Jacob Astor IV, heir to the Astor fortune, son of the Mrs. Astor, writes A Journey in Other Worlds, which is a text that for the first time mentions that the government might actually have a role in spaceflight. This was a completely novel idea in the 1890s, right? No one thought that the government would have any particular need or rationale for engaging in it. But John Jacob Astor IV was a little precise about this, because he actually was thinking about building a spacecraft. And I'll note, had he not died on the Titanic, he would have been contemporary with Robert Goddard and could have actually funded it. But he said that, no, I will build the spacecraft, but I will go to the government for technical expertise and the logistical support of the Navy. It's the first mention of any government potential involvement. And so I think this shows that there was a lot of actual thought that was going into spaceflight well before it becomes a technical reality. And what's particularly interesting for me is that there is a seamless transition from these types of thought experiments to the first actual technological developments for spaceflight. Because Robert Goddard is a teenager, and he reads a different text, which is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds and Garrett P. Service's Edison's Conquest of Mars. And like Tsiolkovsky and Oberth, he chooses to dedicate the rest of his life to spacecraft, or having been inspired by those activities. And since this is Caltech, and I know that the historiography of Robert Goddard has been very much influenced by the negative words that von Karman has said about him in the past, I wanted to make clear that in the words of Wernher von Braun, in the history of rocketry, Dr. Robert H. Goddard has no peers. He was first. He was ahead of everyone in the design, construction, and launching of liquid fuel rockets, which eventually paved the way into space. And I think a lot of us know that he was indeed the first to achieve a significant flight with liquid fuel rocketry. He did dozens of tests in New Mexico. He ultimately achieved about 2.6 kilometers with a gyroscopically stabilized liquid fuel rocket. But what's less well appreciated is he was also the first to raise significant funding for space exploration and technology development. And he's really this example of people who are intrinsically motivated to develop spaceflight technologies, dedicating their labor over dozens of years, not dozens of years, over decades. And that, as an economist, is a really critical part of the economics of all this, because that is a dedication of labor, very highly skilled labor, which is actually not market motivated in any way whatsoever. Right? This is a non-market phenomenon that is really driving a lot of this stuff. So this is the list of every place that Robert Goddard got his money. And you notice something there at the top. What was the first institution in America that was involved with the federal government to give money to spaceflight technology development? It was not NASA. It was not the US Army. It was the Smithsonian, which was a result of a private bequest by James Smithson in the mid-19th century. And Robert Goddard writes a letter to them. They write back a check. And this was a big surprise to him that you could do this. And they really become his main supporters from the federal government. And they actually introduce him then to the US Army Signal Corps during the First World War. And actually, Goddard ends up here in Pasadena working with George Ellery Hale because the US Army Signal Corps wanted to keep him away from potentially prying eyes on the East Coast. And so interestingly, it wasn't even the Second World War where the military starts funding this stuff. It was in the First World War that military investment starts to actually influence space technology development. And Goddard at this time was actually still working on solids. He was thinking about essentially kind of a Gatling gun approach to solid fuel rocketry. It was kind of multi-stage, but it would be shooting out these cores of solid fuel rockets. Unsurprisingly, this doesn't work terribly well. And after the First World War, he goes back to Clark University, where he then publicly announces that he is going to develop a spaceflight vehicle. And contrary to the kind of popular opinion, which is that, well, the public didn't really, think very much of this, and he was poo-pooed by the, New York Times. In fact, the public went wild. And the kind of stuff that we're seeing today with all these volunteers just, wanting to go to Mars as soon as possible, the exact same thing was happening for Robert Goddard in the 1920s. Everyone wanted to get on his rocket. You'd have these people like, my favorite guy is the captain of the New York City Air Police, Captain Claude Collins, who declares publicly that he will volunteer to go on this moon-going rocket if the public will just put up money for an insurance policy for his children should something happen. And then, of course, everyone says, well, heck with that. I'll go for free, right? We don't need an insurance policy. I'll go. And you get dozens of people publicly declaring that they're going to go to space. And, of course, the newspapers love this because it's great copy. It's really fascinating stuff. And eventually, Robert Goddard kind of gets annoyed because all these people are volunteering to help, and no one's actually putting up any money. Which is something that I think we're familiar with today as well. Anyways, that dies down because ultimately he actually hasn't yet, even at that time, switched over to his liquid fuel rocketry development project. So after that dies down, he then goes back to Clark, works in liquid fuel rocketry, achieves his first flight on Aunt Effie's farm. And after that, after there's a particular explosion that makes his rocketry development efforts known again to the public, a very interesting thing happens, which is that well, there's two versions of the story. One is that Buzz Aldrin's father, Edwin Aldrin Sr., hears about this and puts Goddard in touch with Charles Lindbergh. This is the version that Buzz told me, so take that for what that's worth. And the other version of the story is that Guggenheim, Harry Guggenheim and Lindbergh are sitting in the kitchen, and Harry Guggenheim's wife kind of reads the story of Goddard's rocket to them, and then they determine that they should get in touch with this guy and start funding his rocketry development efforts. And ultimately they do. Guggenheim becomes the biggest funder for his projects, along with Charles Lindbergh. And interestingly enough, Charles Lindbergh actually also flies Goddard up to see Harry Guggenheim. So if you can just imagine that historical moment for a second, right? Robert Goddard, the developer of liquid fuel rocketry, flying for the first time in Lindbergh's personal plane to go up and visit Guggenheim. I mean, these kind of romantic stories of space exploration, date back well before NASA. Eventually, however, Goddard is committed to trying to get military funding. He has the same belief that von Braun does, that the only way to fund this is to go into the military, develop rockets there. And in fact, after being funded for many years by the Guggenheims, he leaves the comfort of New Mexico, actually much to the chagrin of the Guggenheim Foundation. They wanted to keep supporting him. But for the course of the Second World War, he moves to Annapolis to work for the Navy and pretty much dies within 2 years, killed by the stress of government work, which is something I can very much sympathize with. But anyways, the total numbers, again, are instructive. The GDP ratio equivalent number is about $60 million of funding, right? And even if you want to take the production worker compensation number is $18 million. So anyway you cut this, he was a very well-funded researcher. He did pretty well for himself at a time when there was actually no government agency dedicated to spaceflight development. And again, the majority of the money comes from the private sector. The Guggenheim family, from the Smithsonian, a variety of different funds within the Smithsonian, and Clark University came in at really critical moments too. So you've got academia, military, private individuals. The only thing that you're missing out for in this list are private companies, but he actually started, he tried to found one of those too. It just didn't end up working out so well. All right, but Goddard wasn't even alone. In the 1930s, you have a large number of private societies and individuals coming together to develop spaceflight technology. And the most well-known one is the American Rocket Society. This was started as the American Interplanetary Society by a bunch of really kind of science fiction writers and kind of rocket hackers in New York. Hugo Gernsback is, of course, the father of science fiction pulps in the US. And they formed the society, and eventually, in the 1960s, they merged with the American Institute for Aeronautics to become the AIAA. So even today, our kind of community infrastructure dates back to this day of private sector organizations and societies really being at the cutting edge of spaceflight technology development. And this private society also spins off the first real company dedicated to space technology development, which is Reaction Motors Incorporated. And of course, you know, not only were they founded, and not only did they start to develop regeneratively cooled engines, they're also one of the first to get venture capital funding from Lawrence Rockefeller. About $500,000 in 1947. And so, you know, this idea that there's this new phenomenon where companies are being formed to do spaceflight technology development, that Elon Musk represents something terribly new, it's not true at all. It's actually a return to what was once the norm of American spaceflight development. So this is kind of where we are standing at the eve of the founding of NASA. You've got dozens of US observatories all across the country. You've got all these fascinating private rocket societies, right? The Peoria Rocket Association. How awesome would that be to read the minutes from the Peoria Rocket Association in the 1930s? Chicago Rocket Society, the Detroit Rocket Society, the Cleveland Rocket Society, the Yale Rocket Club, the MIT Rocket Society. And of course here, GALCET, right? We stand in one of the buildings of one of the organizations that predates NASA was working on spaceflight technology development. Of course, GALCET has its own spin-off company, which is Aerojet. There in the Mojave, you can actually see some of the origins of that, the Pacific Rocket Society. And Crescent Engineering, which was the kind of father company that was funding the Pacific Rocket Society, started working out of the Mojave in the 1930s and 40s. And then, of course, you also have the NACA centers, right? The federal research labs that were dedicated to aeronautical development that ultimately move into NASA. And of course, then coming in here from the right-hand side of the screen are the Germans, right? Eventually, they have to actually start out in Mexico because they weren't allowed to come into the US directly. They kind of rot in Fort Bliss for quite a long time until the Army figures out what to do with them, until they're finally allowed to move into Huntsville, and they become, of course, Redstone Arsenal and then Marshall Space Flight Center. So that's where it stands until this part of the story that we all know, right? 1957, Sputnik, NASA, federal agency gets founded for the first time, a federal agency dedicated to helping Americans get into space. And then, of course, you've got the Mercury 7. You've got hipster von Braun, right, here in his audition for the most interesting man in the world. He didn't often wear a beard, but when he did, he looked pretty hardcore. Okay, so what changes here in this period? Well, there's a lot of different arguments, and the one that I want to put forth today is that what changes is that the signaling value of space exploration is so important for a very brief period of time because of the information asymmetry across the world in this battle between the superpowers. And signaling theory is this idea that through costly action, you can credibly transmit information. And one of the kind of most common ways that we're familiar with it is in kind of expensive clothing or, for example, expensive cars, right? If you see someone driving a Lamborghini, you don't really know whether or not they have any particular wealth right now, but you know that at some point they have had access either to a line of credit or to a social network that can provide this rather expensive good. So you don't know everything about this person, but you know something. You know some piece of information because it is costly. And if you want to think about being in Ghana or in Vietnam in 1957, you've got a particular information asymmetry there too. This is pre-jet age, so you don't really know, none of your friends have really been to Moscow or to Washington. You have some information through the newspapers and through radio, but those can be propagandized. And so it's not quite clear what you know about these two superpowers. But if you know one thing, which is that you can see the glint of an upper stage as it flies overhead, or that you can actually intercept one of the radio transmissions of the spacecraft, you know something really meaningful about one of those countries, right? Which is that one of them has the technological and economic organizational capacity to launch things into space, and the other does not. And so this was why Sputnik was so important, because it gave the world new information about the relative capabilities of the Soviet Union. And interestingly enough, the signaling kind of hypothesis also explains why Eisenhower was not particularly worried, because he was the commander-in-chief and he knew a lot about what the Soviet Union could actually do. And there's this really interesting study done by Gabriel Almond in the late 50s or early 60s, where he shows that the farther away you are from the Soviet Union, the more space achievements changed your opinion about their capability. right? This is the information asymmetry part. If you're in East Germany and you hear that the Russians just sent someone into space, you're like, yeah, great, glad you sent someone into space, but we know what the rest of your economy looks like. But if you're in Spain or Portugal or Italy, you are deeply impressed because you probably haven't been there, and what you really know is that they just did something in space. Just to finish up on this, I want to kind of quote from one of my favorite documents of all time, which is the Rand Corporation's first publication, which is the preliminary design of an experimental world-circling spaceship in 1946. And so this is what they say. Since master of the elements is a reliable index of material progress, the nation which first makes significant achievements in space travel will be acknowledged as the world leader in both military and scientific techniques. To visualize the impact on the world, one can imagine the consternation and admiration that would be felt here if the United States were to discover suddenly that some other nation had already put up a successful satellite. So, the technocrats and the government eggheads of the US had figured out exactly what was going to happen. The political class was not terribly impressed with this, and that was the case in Russia too. Khrushchev was famously asleep on the night of Sputnik because he didn't really expect anything to happen. So yeah, so the techs are going to launch this thing into space. Okay, good for them. Little did he know that the world was just about to change. And I'll also just note this quote by Johnson, which I really like too. It really just underlines why this was so important. And this is a public statement that the vice president made. One can predict with confidence that failure to master space means being second best in the crucial arena of our Cold War world. In the eyes of the world, first in space means first, period. Second in space is second in everything. So for a very brief period of time, nothing is more important politically for the United States of America than achievements in space. And this brief period of time is what kind of leads me to use this rather provocative term of the Apollo anomaly. And to be clear, the Apollo program was not only one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century, it was also a personal inspiration to me and I know many others. But I think as we consider how we move forward from here, I think it's clear to we must be clear to recognize the anomalous nature in which the Apollo program was authorized by the political system and it was able to gather as many resources as it did. John Logston has done a really incredible job really tracing down the motivations of Kennedy. And it's very clear that Kennedy had no particular enthusiasm for space exploration whatsoever. This was a political necessity. And it was a political necessity because of what happened in 1961. First, the flight of Yuri Gagarin, and then second, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba. And it was quite personal because, of course, Eisenhower, who was a general in the Second World War, had no particular reason to be insecure about his role as commander-in-chief. But Kennedy did. He didn't have that kind of experience to draw on. And so it becomes briefly incredibly important. And to understand how brief this was, it's really important to recognize that later in 1961, Kennedy had already changed his mind. He was prepared to offer the Apollo program as a cooperative development initiative with the Soviet Union, this time not to signal American technological superiority, but to signal an intent for peace. And there's a lot of speculation, and it can only ever be speculation, about what would have happened had Kennedy not been assassinated. Because the week before his assassination, he had already been publicly talking about scaling down the space effort and potentially not actually going through with Apollo. This was the rationale that really kind of dominated the Apollo decision, and I think Robert McNamara gives a very clear-eyed sense of what it was. All large-scale space programs require the mobilization of resources on a national scale. They require the development and successful application of the most advanced technologies. Dramatic achievements in space therefore symbolize the technological power and organizing capacity of a nation, the signaling idea again. It is for reasons such as these that major achievements in space contribute to national prestige. This is my favorite part. This is true even though the scientific, commercial, or military value of the undertaking may, by ordinary standards, be marginal or economically unjustified. Which is not to say that there aren't commercial and scientific and military value for the technology, but simply that that was not the motivation for any of this. It was geopolitical signaling. Okay, so how does American spaceflight develop after Apollo? Well, Nixon is really one of those classic tragic comic characters of American history, and really any sort of grand narrative of American history can't have him in it. He cancels the last 3 Apollo missions. Congress, of course, was also lacking in enthusiasm for space technology, limiting NASA's budget starting in 1965, even before the Apollo program had been achieved. And Nixon's rationale for continuing to fund this was really very simple. Caspar Weinberger, who is his deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget, basically wrote a memo that said, well, I don't really know what it is we're going to do in space, but we need to do something because spaceflight was here to stay. And very famously, Nixon kind of put his formal agreement to this by a single line written on that memo that you can go read in the public records. Okay, I agree with Cap. That was the extent of thought that went into this particular political decision in the White House. And this note from the deputy administrator of NASA at the time in the meeting with Nixon is very interesting. Even if it was not a good investment, the nation would have to do it anyways because spaceflight was here to stay. Men, and this time women in the Soviet Union, but not yet in America, are flying in space now and will continue to fly in space, and we'd best be part of it. And of course, it's interesting because this is only 11 years after people have been flying in space, and already it's taken as this standard thing that we just now do. We, the American people, go into space, and we best continue to do it. And if you want some explanation for this, I kind of return to my Thorsten Veblen. Right? It is much more difficult to recede from a scale of expenditure once adopted than it is to extend the accustomed scale in response to an accession of wealth. Or as we more commonly say, a luxury once acquired becomes a necessity. And so spaceflight was one of these social luxuries that now was seen as a necessity of American political life. And actually, in many respects, human spaceflight reaches a certain sort of narrative high point in the 1980s. With President Reagan, because President Reagan loves spaceflight, right? And if you want evidence of that, you can look at his campaign for his second term. And if you look at his campaign brochures, goal number 2 is develop space, America's next frontier. And if you can imagine what that would look like today, if today a presidential candidate came out with their political campaign agenda and said, our goal number 2 is to develop space, I think it tells you something specific about the atmosphere around space in the 1980s. And so why did President Reagan put forth this idea of a space station? Well, because it was morning in America, right? Wake up and smell the America. And he had this large deficit to deal with. So he needed a high visibility program that signaled this positive vision of an American future, and at the same time something that wasn't going to break the bank. And NASA had suggested that the space station was only going to cost $8 billion, and as the numbers will show later on, it cost a little bit more than that. And so this seemed like a very good proposal. But then, things changed very significantly in 1986 with the Challenger disaster. And that really kind of puts an end to a particular type of thinking, which was that the space shuttle was going to usher in an era of cheap, reusable, safe space flight. And we understood after Challenger that it was, by this point, neither cheap or terribly reusable and not safe. And then the end of the Cold War in 1991 also reduces the fundamental political demand for expensive new signals. And Clinton actually then uses the signaling phenomena to signal the opposite, which was the desire for a reduced government expenditure profile. And the total expenditure of all of his spending cuts in 1993, 2% of them are represented by his redesign of the space station. Okay, so these are the numbers. As you can see, the Apollo program, right, represents the very similar type of volatility that we saw in astronomical observatories, right? Large peak followed by not necessarily a trough, but by a very significantly reduced expenditure. The space shuttle actually cost in total dollars more than the Apollo program. It was just spent over a much larger period of time. And there you can see the kind of $77 billion that is the space station expenditure, slightly more than the $8 billion estimated. And that does not also include the expenditure for the shuttle flights to build the space station. That's included in the space shuttle expenditure. Okay, so meanwhile, the American private sector starts to get re-engaged with space right after Apollo. And I start off with this story not because it was ever achieved or particularly important historically, but it is wonderfully representative of this new enthusiasm that emerges. The Harvest Moon Project in 1970-72 was done by this group, the Committee for the Future, which was a very idealistic and kind of utopian group led by Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was the heiress to the Marx toy fortune. And you can see one of the toy lines there in the upper left-hand corner. And they proposed to use this Apollo hardware that was canceled to do a privately funded mission to the moon. And what's interesting is that they actually had support from the chair of the House Science Committee's Manned Spaceflight Subcommittee, Olin Teague, who was a big supporter of the Apollo program. And he actually introduced into the House a resolution calling for NASA to do this. And so even at this early stage in the 1970s, there's already people in Congress and the American private sector saying, well, okay, this government project to go to the moon is over. How do we as a people continue to engage in this process of exploration? And then, of course, by the mid-80s, you have the space colonies, right? The L5 Society with over 10,000 members of people who are convinced that they are going to go live in that version of California that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, right? California in space at massive levels. And this then also kind of kicks off a significant process of new companies being formed to engage in spaceflight. One of the best kind of stories is MirCorp. And if you guys haven't seen the documentary Orphans of Apollo, I would definitely recommend it because it has the story of these anarcho-capitalists going over to Russia in a very brief period of time, taking over the Russian space station through kind of American capitalist gumption. And it's really a fascinating story of the hairy edge of private space sector development. All right, so then you get the internet, you get internet wealth, right? And all of a sudden you have a whole new cadre of people founding, this time with very significant capital, new space companies. The previous generation did not have as much money as the Jeff Bezoses and the Larry Pages and the Paul Allens of the world. And interestingly, there at the bottom, the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, which is a kind of industry group that represents these companies, recently released their estimate of the total expenditure between 2004 and 2014 on commercial spaceflight development. It's $2.5 billion. Very comparable to the decadal expenditures we were seeing for private observatories in the 19th century. Okay, and so this has now been integrated into NASA's mainline commercial crew program. Two of those companies that received initial funds for commercial crew development, Blue Origin and SpaceX, were funded by private sector individuals, right? Our modern Carnegies and Rockefellers, the people who had been funding private observatories back in the 19th century, are today starting space companies and now being integrated into NASA's programs. And this is NASA's plan for the future exploration of Mars. Our first objective is to develop an economic ecosystem with the International Space Station, to develop new U.S. commercial crew capabilities. We then know that we need to experiment and develop the technology to go beyond low Earth orbit again. We don't have that capability anymore. It's been well over 40 years since we were able to do that. But our ultimate objective is increasingly being recognized as Mars. And I think that is very interesting for the reason that it's not just a federal government objective, it is also a private objective. And so we're starting to see an alignment of private sector interests and public sector interests driving a particular objective for space exploration. So I think it's going to be a very interesting next couple of decades. So finally, what are the takeaway messages for this long space age? First is that private funding and intrinsic motivations for space exploration have a very robust history and at times have been the primary source of support. This intrinsic motivation is really critical. The other is this desire for signal. Signaling motivations, both in governmental and individually. One of the things I didn't mention, of course, is a lot of people like Yerkes and Carnegie and Rockefeller are not necessarily funding these observatories because they are particularly passionate about astronomy. They're doing it to ameliorate their rather negative public images. And so Yerkes very famously was known for kind of having done some very bad rolling stock for trains. And he funded the Yerkes Observatory because he wanted to get a better reputation. He funds it, big ceremony, everyone loves him, but eventually they forget about that. In 2 years, they run him out of town. So there's a bunch of different signaling motivations involved, but they're a regular source of support over the last couple hundred years. Expenditure on space exploration has been very volatile. So if you are interested in going into the space exploration business and you also want a steady, easy life, that is probably not a good idea. It is continually volatile, as you would expect with any particular exploration agenda. The fourth one is, for me, in many ways, the most important. Institutional transitions and the regular creation of new institutions have been an important feature of the evolution of American space exploration capabilities over time. Right? Our movement into space is not the history of NASA. Right? It is the history of many different organizations that are continually founded and then refounded. The Smithsonian, the observatories, the American Rocket Society becoming the AIAA, the NACA, NASA, the U.S. Army, the L5 Society, new private sector companies, right? This is a continual process, and as we think about how we evolve our capabilities in space, we have to think about what new institutions are required, not just how do we reform old ones. And then finally, if you want to think about this from a kind of economic dynamics perspective, you can think about space exploration as being an economic outcome that is the result of the interaction of actors with this taste for space exploration, right? This intrinsic motivation, this dedication to space exploration, who either then self-support themselves, like Elon Musk, or who enter into exchange with others, like Robert Goddard, on some basis for the resources to achieve these objectives. And so I think rather than thinking about this as a particular political agenda, thinking about it as this, this process that emerges from people who want to go into space, exchanging their labor and capabilities with others is probably a more effective way to think about it. So I'll give the final words here to Robert Goddard as an example of that process and what that dedication means. Now, how many more years I shall be working on the problem, I do not know. I hope as long as I live. There can be no thought of finishing, for aiming at the stars, both literally and figuratively, is a problem to occupy generations, so that no matter how much progress one makes, there is always the thrill of just beginning. When this was from his personal letter to H.G. Wells, who was the person who had inspired him when he was a teenager. And so even if you want to think about space exploration as this process of 200 years of American citizens thinking about and exploring space, we're still just beginning. And so I hope that some of you are thinking about continuing that process with your labors. Thank you very much.